And we really need to take a step back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't be consuming this information. Google needs us in a way more than we need Google.
Nobody trusts the news. We have business model problems, misinformation, fake news. We have so many things in the mix. And I always get the same question. People ask me, where do I find real news? And how can I be a good news consumer? That's why we brought Jeffrey, who's been studying this. What should I tell these people? You've been studying this. What should we tell these people?
Well, tell them to slow down, for one thing. That when I was teaching, 18, 19-year-olds, and they were overwhelmed. They were really kind of drowning in stuff. It wasn't knowledge. It was just sort of an information flow. And it was like, I described it as like taking a drink from a fire hose. You don't get a lot of liquid. You don't get a lot of sustenance, and it kind of rips your lips off. And this has been part of the issue. One of the reasons I wrote the book was to kind of help these young people, and maybe some not so young people, figure out techniques for handling this tsunami of information that we see all the time, whether it's as soon as we wake up, we turn on our smartphones or we turn on our computers, and then we go to traditional media and see what's going on, and the flow is constant. And so what's happened is that news organizations, which used to compete amongst themselves, are now competing with Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. And so the idea of a news organization giving thoughtful, contextualized, edited information has disappeared, especially over the last few years as things have become much more frenzied. And the politics everywhere, not just in the United States, but in Canada and the UK, and now with the war in Ukraine, people are really finding it hard to manage. And so what I decided to do was to help people understand that they need to slow down, be a little bit skeptical, and to check the sources. This, to me, is the critical point. If you can verify where the information comes from, then you're ahead of the game. And what we're seeing is that media organizations, even the responsible, respectable ones, are finding the economic system that they're in now very complicated, not very easy. And so there is a desire to kind of see if they can find that missing audience that disappeared into the internet, and to reassemble it somehow in order to resume the kind of profit margin that they enjoyed 5 to 10 years ago.
And maybe we can even slow down and talk about what are the kind of steps that a consumer should take to feel good about who they're reading or watching.
Right. I think one of the things is that because so much information is now put on the internet, it's really important for consumers of information to look closely at who's doing the reporting. Is this a familiar name? Where does this information come from? Has the reporter, has the media organization been really clear about how they got the story, who their sources were? Are they quoting anonymous sources, in which case there should be a good stated reason why they're not identifying their sources? That's sort of the first level, the first way to triage the information as it's coming across to you. And if you're looking at the information online, go to the bottom of that homepage, scroll down, and see if you can find a link that says About Us, and click on that. And that should tell you a lot about who's behind this information, where it's come from, and how you can contact someone if you want to have an opinion about what you've just consumed. And I think that when you go to a website and there's no About Us, then I think we have to kind of consider that this is a little bit skeptical, that we're in a kind of sketchy area. and we really need to take a step back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't be consuming this information. We think that when we go to Google and we have a Gmail account that we have made a deal with Google that we can use their email accounts, when in fact, we, the consumers, are now the product. Google needs us in a way more than we need Google or any of the others. And I think that this is something that we need to also be aware of, that every time we go online, somebody knows a little bit more about us, who we are, what we're watching, what we're buying, what we're consuming. I mean, I was looking for, a few months ago when it was really cold here in Canada, I needed a new set of gloves for the winter. So I went online and I found a pair, and then suddenly I'm being flooded with ads for other gloves. I only have a pair of hands. And I think that this just shows you that they are tracking us all the time. I don't mean to sound paranoid, but the reality is that we live in what's called now a surveillance society, that somebody is watching us, everything we do, every time we go online, all the time. Most of the time, that's fine. Sometimes it might not be so good.
So I look at websites sometimes and I see it and someone sends me a website and I'm like, oh, this is completely biased. But it's sort of in my inherent brain because I was a journalist for so many years. Have you thought about how people can teach themselves how to see something and be like, this is bias?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I'll be teaching a course on media ethics this summer at the University of Toronto. And one of the lectures I've just finished creating is there good bias and is there bad bias? And of course there's good bias, in the sense that if you are a journalist and you think that we should be spending a little more time covering issues in rural communities and not just concentrate on the big cities, that's a bias. And that's, in a way, that's a good bias. A bad bias is when people say, I'm only going to look at stuff on the internet that confirms my suspicions. And that's where we get into trouble. And there's a lot of what the sociologists call bias confirmation. This is where people go online and only deal with ideas and people with whom they are familiar and supportive and or entertained. I mean, the difficulty now is that as media organizations, the so-called responsible ones, try to provide the information that people need as citizens and not just as consumers, this is where the trouble starts. Because media organizations, even the good ones, take a list of the people who have clicked on their websites, and they're selling that information to political parties, to survey groups, to pollsters, to anyone who will pay for them. And I think that this is now also part of the deal, that we as citizens need to demand a better way in which media organizations handle our information that we have handed over to them for free, and they're profiting from it.